For half a century, the rules of the off-road SUV market never changed. If you wanted something that looked tough, felt indestructible, and made people turn their heads in a car park, you paid for it. Land Rover made billions on that idea. Mercedes made an entire cult around it with the G-Wagon. The unwritten rule was simple. Real capability costs real money, somewhere between 60 grand and six figures, no shortcuts, no exceptions. Then in 2026, a car nobody in Europe was watching quietly became one of the fastest-selling new nameplates on British roads. It has a flat, upright nose. It has a boxy stance that looks drawn with a set square. It uses an aluminum structure that would make supercar engineers raise an eyebrow. And it costs a fraction of what the badge name alternatives demand. This is the Jaecoo J6. We're going through exactly what makes this thing tick the metal it's built from. The way it lets you see straight through the bonnet. One small detail on the tailgate almost nobody's talking about yet. And because I'm not just here to sell you on it, the honest questions, stick around for that last part especially, because it changes how you should actually think about this thing. Why does every serious off-roader look like a box? Before the engineering, something worth sitting with nothing to do with torque figures, everything to do with how your brain reads a shape. Right now, the vehicles holding their value best in showrooms are still the boxy ones. Flat roofs, vertical windscreens, sharp corners. None of that is efficient. None of it is aerodynamic. People pay a premium for it anyway, because straight lines read as strength to the human eye. A box says, "I will protect you," in a way a smooth, swoopy crossover never will. That's why the G-Wagon silhouette has barely shifted since the 1970s round the edges even slightly, and the spell breaks. But there's a catch biting the entire industry mid-EV transition. A flat vertical face punching through air is a nightmare for range. With combustion, you just fit a bigger tank. With a battery, that same drag drains cells faster, which means a bigger battery, which means more weight, which means more drag. That spiral has killed off more than one promising electric off-roader concept before production. Most manufacturers looked at that spiral and quietly gave up on the boxy EV. Jaecoo asked a different question. What if the body panels themselves stopped being the heaviest part of the car? The material decision nobody expected from a mainstream brand. The J6 is built around a multi-cavity, fully aluminum body structure. Almost every car on the road today, expensive or cheap, is still built primarily from steel cheap, strong, and the default since the assembly line was invented. Steel also rusts. Aluminum sidesteps that roughly a third of the weight of steel for the same volume, resistant to that kind of corrosion, and engineered properly, it can match or beat steel's strength. The reason it hasn't been standard for 80 years is cost. Shaping it traditionally meant slow, expensive, hand-finished work, which is why it's historically lived almost exclusively in Range Rovers and six-figure supercars. Jaecoo got around that with gigacasting, the industry's biggest cost lever right now. A machine generating thousands of tons of clamping force injects molten aluminum into a single mold and produces one massive structural piece in one shot instead of welding together dozens of smaller steel sections. That does two things immediately. It strips out hundreds of weld points historically where cracks and corrosion start first, and it cuts weight dramatically across the platform. The result: a vehicle reported at around 1,800 kilograms despite carrying a roughly 70 kilowatt-hours battery pack that, alone, weighs several hundred kilos. Without that aluminum structure, this doesn't work as an off-roader. But weight is only half the story here. The bigger, long-term story is durability. And it matters more now, with buyers holding onto vehicles longer amid higher interest rates on new car loans. Steel corrodes when it's wet. Aluminum shrugs it off. Run the J6 through river crossings. Park it on a salted coastal road for a decade. Drag it through mud every weekend for years. The structure isn't fighting a slow chemical battle the whole time. Jaecoo markets this platform around a multi-decade structural lifespan, worth flagging that this is a manufacturer claim on a genuinely new nameplate, not something with a decade of real-world data behind it yet. What is verifiable? It's a materials, Science decision baked into the frame before a single body panel was stamped, and that alone changes how the car feels from behind the wheel. A structure that doesn't flex or creak gives the driver something a horsepower number never can. Confidence. Can an electric SUV actually survive real mud? Here's the part that makes traditional off-roaders nervous, and it's a fair instinct. The J6 runs no diesel engine, no transfer case, no mechanical locking differentials, 2 electric motors, 1 battery, a lot of software. If capability meant a growling engine and a mechanical drivetrain you could see and touch, an all-electric off-roader feels inherently fragile. So what happens at the bottom of a deep river crossing? Jaecoo's high-voltage system, both motors and the battery pack, is rated for dust and water sealing well beyond a splash in a puddle, engineered around owners actually driving through rivers rather than just posing in a car park. Worth checking the exact ingress rating on Jaecoo's official spec sheet before you quote a number on camera brochures vary slightly by market. But sealing the hardware is the easy part. The real advantage of going electric off-road is instant torque. A diesel needs a moment to build revs. A turbo needs to spool. Gears need to shift. On tarmac. Invisible. Halfway up a muddy incline with one wheel spinning. That fraction of a second is the difference between crawling forward and getting stuck. The J6's dual-motor setup produces up to 279 HP and 385 Nm of torque. Available the instant you touch the pedal, the software managing torque split between axles reacts in milliseconds the moment a wheel loses grip. Power shifts to the wheels that still have it. No mechanical diff lock required. For the driver, it doesn't feel like a computer intervening. It feels like more grip than physics should allow. The feature that sounds like science fiction? One feature keeps stopping people mid-scroll this year. A wraparound transparent chassis camera mode. The problem it solves crawling toward a sharp rock or an uncertain water crossing, the bonnet blocks your view of exactly the ground that matters. You stop and walk around, or you rely on instinct. New drivers get this wrong constantly, and it costs them wheels and bumpers. Cameras mounted under the mirrors, in the front grille, and at the rear feed a processor that factors in speed, steering angle, and suspension travel, then stitches it into a live 3D render on the touchscreen. The bonnet effectively disappears on screen. You watch your own front tires approach an obstacle from inside a sealed cabin. Pair that with real ground clearance and approach. Departure angles built for genuine terrain. Figures vary slightly by market and trim, so check the spec sheet for your region before quoting exact numbers. And you've got a vehicle built to eat serious terrain while showing the driver what's happening underneath the entire time. A detail hiding in plain sight on the tailgate. Walk around the back, and you'll spot something that looks exactly like a spare wheel cover square. Side hinge mounted, unmistakably tire-shaped. It isn't a tire. Open it, and there's an external storage box bolted to the outside of the car. Sounds small until you think about what it solves. Off-roading generates gear you don't want near a clean interior, mud-caked recovery straps, soaked boots, filthy charging cables. Normally, you ruin the boot carpet or leave the gear at home. This box takes that problem outside the cabin entirely. Fill it, click it shut, and the inside stays exactly as clean as when you left the driveway. It's a minor spec sheet line, but it says a lot about who this was actually designed for, someone who uses an off-roader, not someone who wants to look like they might. Stepping inside. Get inside, and the first thing that hits you is quiet acoustic glass and a sealed aluminum shell soaking up wind and road noise at a level you'd expect from something costing considerably more. The dashboard is almost entirely free of physical buttons. A 15 6-inch touchscreen running on a Qualcomm Snapdragon 8155 chip, the same processor class found in flagship smartphones, handles nearly everything. Compare that to a traditional European SUV at a similar price point, and the gap is obvious. Carried over physical switches, a smaller, dated-feeling screen, an instrument cluster nobody's needed to glance at since digital displays became standard. That's not the older cars being broken, it's them being a product of a platform designed years ago to also accommodate diesel and petrol variants. Decades of supplier relationships baked in. Jaecoo didn't inherit that baggage. This platform was designed from a blank sheet for an electric architecture and a software-first cabin from day one. What we don't actually know yet, and here's the honest part I owe you before the big picture close. This is a brand new nameplate from a young, sub-brand real-world reliability data simply doesn't exist yet at the scale a G-Wagon or a Land Cruiser has. Charging infrastructure and right-hand drive availability aren't uniform everywhere the car is being sold, so fastest selling needs a in the markets where it's actually available attached to it. And a transparent chassis camera system. However good the demo footage looks, is still a software layer between you and the ground. It doesn't replace the mechanical simplicity a die-hard off-roader trusts when the electronics have a bad day. None of that erases what this car gets right. It just means cheaper G-Wagon and proven G-Wagon beater are two very different claims, and only one of them is true yet. What this actually means for the rest of the decade. Step back from the spec sheet. For 50 years, the premium off-roader formula barely changed. Steel body, powerful engine, mechanical four-wheel drive, a badge that justified the premium. That formula worked because only a handful of manufacturers on Earth had the decades of expertise and capital to execute it. Jaecoo didn't close that gap, gradually it sidestepped it. Aluminium instead of steel, electric motors instead of a diesel block, software instead of mechanical hardware. You don't need 100 years of diesel engineering if you're not running a diesel. Change the underlying technology stack, and the competitive landscape rearranges itself. This isn't a slightly cheaper G-Wagon. It's a different question. Not, how do we build a cheaper version of what already exists? But, what does the buyer actually want to feel? And what's the most direct way to deliver that with the tools available in 2026? The answer turned out to be an aluminium-bodied, dual-motor, software-driven SUV with a boxy face, a floor you can effectively see through, and a fake spare tire, hiding a mud box. Legacy brands aren't sitting still. They're building their own gigacasting lines and electric platforms right now, and the gap will close over time. But right now, this year, the J6 is proof of a principle the industry will spend the rest of the decade wrestling with. A tough, capable, emotionally satisfying SUV doesn't have to cost a fortune, and it doesn't have to come from the same handful of brands that have owned this space for 50 years. So here's the actual question. If this showed up in your country tomorrow at a genuinely competitive price, would you cross-shop it against a traditional diesel off-roader? Or is the badge still doing more work than the engineering? Tell me which one in the comments, because I'm genuinely split, and if you want the follow-up where I put this next to an actual Defender on real trail terrain, that video's coming, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it.